the introduction, and thank you to everyone who's organized and contributed to this great conference. I feel a little bad because I'm at the very end of the show in terms of presentations and all of these exceptional presentations on how to optimize your performance or athlete's performance. And some of you are worried if I'm going to say, stop, don't do it, it's bad. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to cover a bunch of different points. Is more better for the heart, and is there a limit? Are there adaptations that are beneficial? Well, of course there are, and I'll cover those quickly. Can exercise break your heart, essentially? And that's the salient question in the general population, in the athletic world, when we see such horrible outcomes as cardiac sudden death. It is an unimaginable loss for a parent, for a brother, for a sister. Of course, it's for the individual. But it also is so incongruous because that individual reflects the epitome of health. This isn't supposed to happen. And of course, the question is how, why, can we detect it, can we prevent it? What are those causes? And the challenges of this research, the challenges of answering those questions is enormous. But overall, our objective is to reduce risk. And hopefully we'll provide some perspective. If I can do anything today, it will help organize some thoughts so that you can see a little more clearly what the issues are, because I have to say the scientific literature and the lay literature has contributed enormously to confusion. And there's a lot of mixing of issues that really have nothing to do with each other, but the overall overarching message is very, very positive. Obviously, what we want to do is see as much of this type of activity as possible, these triathlons, marathons, not just at the elite level, but in the sub-elite and the recreational. And we certainly see it in the explosion of endurance participation. What we don't want to see are these tragic kind of events. At the London Marathon, this was an image taken at the Toronto Marathon. The big question is, why do these people drop and in some cases die of cardiac sudden death? The good news and the overarching news is very, very good indeed. So for example, in the population studies, when we look at daily physical activity across a wide range of physical activity exposures, from moderate to more intense, to the levels at which international caliber athletes are at. When we look at all-cause mortality reduction, more is better. But obviously, even at the light levels of exercise, and certainly at the intensive ones where exercise volume is enormous, the response is not linear, but it's rather asymptotic. So we eventually see a diminishing return of effect. And this is with respect to all-cause mortality reduction. This has nothing to do with, although it does relate to some extent into performance yields as the diminishing return effect becomes quite dominant. But there's no question that it's better for you. Mortality risks are lower at various levels of exposure to physical activity. And I think the most responsible, most accurate reflection of these data are shown in these two slides, where the most significant drop in all-cause mortality risk or overarching risk reduction occurs actually at the relatively light levels of exposure. Frankly, it's the levels that we have advocated and form activity guidelines in Canada, the United States, across the world. And the sustained reductions occur throughout increasing quartiles, quintiles, however you want to describe the responses. Similarly, some people have referred to it as a reverse J phenomena, where the greatest risk reduction occurs at the lighter levels and plateaus, with a little bit of a sneaky little curve, like a hockey stick, at the high levels of exercise. I'm going to come back to that. And the question is there truth to that? And does this J, or this hockey stick, start to become a U, where you completely lose risk and actually expose the general population or high performance athletes to a very high level of risk? When we look at mortality, even at the extremes in the elite athletes, folks who conduct yearly and lifelong competitions, whether it's Tour de France or individuals end up reaching the podium at the Olympics, we know that the mortality rates are lower. These data are dirty. They're riddled with issues of sampling because we can't sample in a way that we would say is a highly rigorous form of data analysis. But overall, whether you take a grab sample of an individual after so many years of competition or throughout various age groups, the overall message is that there's less mortality in high-performance athletes, either in the midst of their competition or years later. So they live longer, they're less prone to chronic diseases, they're much more likely to die during violent acts, such as on their bicycles or in other non-related cardiac circumstances. And there's other data in the literature as well in the general population showing that mortality or longevity is actually increased by as much as about 2 years for the average individual. So what happens with exercise training? The heart gets bigger, it gets stronger, it gets more able to pump. It does not become a massive, oversized bag that's incapable of functioning. It becomes a rather efficient, modestly enlarged, modestly thickened pump, both on the right side and the left side. And of course, the overall objective is to enhance cardiac output. That's what we want. We want individuals to have the highest possible cardiac output because we know that this linear relationship between cardiac output and VO2 max is probably the most fundamental predictor of performance. There are clear advantages that occur in the skeletal muscle and in terms of extraction of oxygen. But the biggest, largest, most profound gains in performance are related to cardiac output. When we look at world-class runners running at the fastest possible marathon times recorded, the cardiac output required is enormous, and the running pace would be equivalent to about an oxygen cost of just over 70 mils per kilogram per minute. That's to run about a 440 miles per hour. I've never been able to convert to kilometers per hour because I've been running since the 70s and I can't do that math. I'm not smart enough. So when you look at the oxygen cost of running, which is relatively fixed, assuming a constant mechanical efficiency, it's a huge oxygen cost. That's going to require a very high cardiac output of about 30 liters a minute. And that shows up way up here on this graph. When we take the average individual off the street and we measure their maximal oxygen consumption, and if we have the ability and we have to measure cardiac output, their cardiac outputs are way down here. So their pump is simply not big enough to move the blood through the vascular system and get it to that muscle where it can be extracted. So cardiac output is where the money is. And the only way the heart can actually do that is to get a little bit bigger. So there's a number of types of remodeling that happens in the heart with chronic exposure to endurance training. One is structural. So the heart gets bigger, and this schematic here shows that the classic understanding is a remodeling that is referred to as eccentric. So essentially, if you could imagine the chamber of your heart as though those muscle cells were your fingers, the eccentric remodeling makes those fingers longer. And as a result, because your muscles are oriented to create a chamber, that chamber gets bigger. As opposed to the concentric remodeling that we tend to see with much more pressure volume overloaded work. The walls get thicker, so those fingers or the sarcomeres of the heart get thicker, but they do not get longer. And as a result, the chamber size is really a reflection of the thickness of the walls and not the chamber themselves. So the ability to fill to a greater extent, to generate a greater stroke volume and a greater cardiac output is limited. So we don't see these kind of adaptations in pure resistance or power athletes like we do with endurance athletes. But it's not dichotomous. The degree of remodeling of the heart is really a function of the extent of the dynamic component and the static component. And when you look at the nature of triathlete training, it's right there. It's probably as some cyclists, high-intensity cyclists, is vulnerable to the greatest stimulus for remodeling. And as a result, we tend to see some large hearts, but again, these hearts are very rarely outside of the normal range, but they're certainly high normal. We're doing a fair amount of work characterizing and phenotyping athletes' hearts now, and we're learning a great deal about the right side of the heart and the atria. So this is a reconstructed image from a cardiac MRI showing the left ventricle and the right ventricle. And I can tell you that in some athletes, the right ventricle, in most of our data, our MRIs are showing that the right ventricle generally is a little larger than the left ventricle. And this has given rise to some, or given added fuel to some of the concerns of enlarged hearts as a result of training, predisposing certain individuals to arrhythmias, because a lot of the arrhythmias that exist are known to occur or arise out of the right ventricular outflow tract, which is part of the right ventricle. But the range of remodeling is enormous. The phenotypic variation ranges from absolutely normal-sized ventricles in long-standing endurance athletes to rather large ventricles. The largest atria that we've seen thus far in about 100 individuals that we've MRI'd, we've seen atria that exceed 110 mils. And that's a little larger than the average ventricle that we see in recreational athletes. In mice, in the mouse model that we're using, these mice, the atria tend to balloon up very quickly with heavy exercise. They sort of look like Mickey Mouse heads with their atria sticking way out of their ventricles. So there's huge heterogeneity in the response. We don't know why some individuals are prone to high degrees of remodeling, but there's clearly a genetic component to it. We also know that women are a little less prone to remodeling than men for potentially a number of reasons, including the free testosterone that's available. But we also know that if you take a group of individuals who are naive to exercise and train them intensively over the course of the year, both their left ventricular and their right ventricular chambers will enlarge substantially. But women tend to have less remodeling, and incidentally, the likelihood of women developing cardiac arrhythmias in the exercise world is also way, way less. The biggest advantage is in the ability of the heart to relax. We actually don't see a great deal of change. There's modest improvements in the systolic performance of the heart, but most of the advantage is in how it fills. These data are a little hard to see here, but we did a study a few years ago where we looked at continuous moderate training and high-intensity interval training. And if you look at some of the indices here, the units aren't important, but if you look at the units here with moderate continuous training versus high-intensity interval training, indices of diastolic function improved significantly, and the ability of the heart to fill improved more significantly with very high-intensity interval training compared to moderate training. The rub is that this was 5 days of high-intensive training, where we were able to demonstrate a significant expansion of filling capacity in addition to plasma volume expansion, which happens early in that training sequence. So we know that the volume is very important. And Ben Levine many years ago showed that the ability of the heart to dilate under low pressure is greatly enhanced as well. So this schematic just shows that the filling pressure of the heart relative to volume is greatly altered with training. So the heart becomes more compliant, and under a low pressure, it fills more rapidly. And the final little twist to the story is related to ventricular twist. The heart as a pump doesn't just pump in a longitudinal fashion, but it twists and rotates, sort of like squeezing a rag out of water, and the recoil or filling of that heart is an essential part of the ventricular filling. In fact, we think it's probably very important in high-performance athletes because the untwist probably contributes to a suction effect, creating the greatest possible filling of the heart. We also see tremendous electrical remodeling with the heart. As you all know, vagal tone is very dominant in athletes, and it contributes to, we think, a large component of the reduction in resting heart rate. We just have a paper where we used a mouse model to actually demonstrate through certain types of vagal and sympathetic blockers that the bradycardia that's associated with exercise training is 100% attributed to parasympathetic tone rather than changes in intrinsic pacemaker responses. Herein lies one of the problems in ascertaining the health of an athlete using the ECG. Apart from high vagal tone, there's significant alterations in the conduction and the electrical remodeling of the heart. And so much change that it leads to unusual electrocardiographic waveforms. The heart tends to re-energize or repolarize its electrical signal more rapidly. And as a result, there are a number of electrical anomalies that are now accepted to be benign, perfectly acceptable changes in the athlete, so that the interpretation of the ECG in the hands of someone who's not aware of these common features of athletic electrical remodeling can lead to very spurious conclusions. And I'll come to that a little bit later when we talk about screening. There's a gathering storm, though, and this is where the understanding of the health of the athlete becomes very, very confused. We have a large number of studies that have linked increasing exercise volume to adverse outcomes and even a reversal of the cardioprotective effects. We've got evidence of acute dysfunction that prolonged exercise can induce on the heart. And we also have, of course, this high emotional content when we see adverse non-sudden death or adverse outcomes during races, because everyone wants to know how we can identify these individuals at risk and how we can prevent those catastrophic events. And that's where the problem becomes very complicated. So we have in the lay press all sorts of spurious claims. Exercise training is bad for you. Your chances of a heart attack are greater for athletes who compete in endurance sports. And I'll tell you something that's absolutely true. The risk of having a cardiac event during exercise is about 5 to 100-fold greater than if you're sitting around at home. Exercise indeed acts as a trigger. However, ironically, all of the data that we have available to us suggests that most people who die of cardiac-related deaths, they don't die on the street and they don't die during races. They die in their home, and a good number of those die in the early waking hours of the day. So that just puts a little bit of perspective on it. There's no question that this classic understanding of risk reduction and physical activity volume has now been challenged. I believe that the data holds out that this curvilinear response is absolutely correct. But I want to point out a couple of examples in another slide that follows this as to where the public and even in the academic literature, there's misleading conclusions. The concept, of course, is that the great reduction in risk is up to a certain level, and then this asymptotic plateauing occurs so that there's no further gains. But there's all of these examples of outcomes, either through acute exposure to prolonged exercise or chronic events or outcomes that create concern. Whether it's increased troponin levels or markers of damage, the chronic increased risk of atrial fibrillation, which I'll get to shortly, and other outcomes that occur and findings create some confusion. Is the acute damage that we see, is it really damage? And are, in fact, athletes at greater risk for certain types of arrhythmias? Well, let's see if we can walk through that. But first I want to talk about two findings that were published in very high impact journals that concluded, in this case, the Copenhagen study. And this group has produced some very good work. If you wait long enough, the conclusions in 2 or 3 years may be the opposite of what they are here, because a few years ago, the results were completely opposite to what they are presently. But what they report is that in a large sample of runners, the folks who report the highest volume of running actually had poor outcomes. So this is one of these forest plots again, and you want to be on the left side of this line. They were on the far right side of the line, which indicates that the likelihood of a sudden cardiac death was actually greater in those who performed the highest levels of exercise. The problem with this data is that when they divided the groups into quintiles of exercise volume, they were not equal. And the group that had the highest rate of death had the absolutely smallest sample, so that a single death would grossly overrepresent the risk. So even though this was published in a very good journal, the data are quite suspect. Another study that's been quoted all over the place is what we refer to as the Million Women study in England. This was not in a group of endurance athletes, but the power of the study, which is why it was likely published in a high-impact journal, was that 1 million women were studied, and again, they broke down the groups according to the levels of physical activity. And you can start to see that as you get to the highest level of physical activity, that's when a number of attributable risks were increasing back to the resting value. And in fact, the highest individuals, if you dissect their data out, and I don't have that graph, they actually had increased worsening outcomes in vascular health. And what's the problem with this data? These data were obtained from the broad population, and physical activity was reported not just from leisure time physical activity, but from occupational activity, number one. And the issue with that is that individuals who do labor in their occupational work tend to come from lower socioeconomic groups and have a high prevalence of smoking. And unfortunately, the message of physical activity does not transcend well into that socioeconomic group. And the other issue is that this entire sample, the people who were overarching reporting higher levels of physical activity, the smoking rate was 25%. That does not reflect the normal cohort of healthy individuals with increasing exposure to physical activity. So I would say that the study is rather flawed. All right, let's look at some of the specific examples. Although these weren't the very first studies, the first study that came out to describe impaired cardiac function with prolonged exercise actually came out of Europe, but this was the second report. And then Pamela Douglas took a group of triathletes after the Ironman and looked at their cardiac performance before and after and showed a degradation of their performance. And these field studies have been reported after ultramarathons, half marathons, full marathons. And they all point to the same conclusion, that in the post-recovery, in the recovery period, there is a degradation of performance. It's as though the heart is stunned. And in some cases, they've evaluated cardiac function 24 hours later, and function has restored. The challenge with some of those studies is that you're exposed to a wide range of hemodynamic conditions, hydration state, temperature, that have direct impact on the actual imaging and outcomes that you're measuring, in this case with echocardiography. I mean, we jumped on the bandwagon in the late 80s, early 90s, and sometime later we looked at a laboratory-based approach, and we examined the hearts of cyclists. We brought these folks down into the echo lab in the hospital, and the cardiologist that I worked with thought I was absolutely insane, because the echo lab was turned into a fitness facility with the triathletes or cyclists bringing their bikes down and working out on turbo trainers. And every 30 minutes we'd get them off their turbo trainer, they'd walk 6 feet over to the echo imaging bed, and we'd resume in their exercise and assess their cardiac function during. And what we did, though, in this case, is before the exercise, we, in a resting state, we gave them a dose of dobutamine, and we challenged their hearts. And dobutamine in a way, acts as an analog to what noradrenaline would do. So it stimulates the heart by triggering increased inotropic or cardiac contractility, and we're able to measure the outcome of performance. And with increasing dose, you get a big bang for your buck, and this measure of strain is simply a measure of systolic performance. And when we did them 60 minutes following 2.5 or in some cases 3 hours of exercise in a different study, they had a greatly diminished response. And we've shown this in high intensity, low intensity, young, old. The result is the same. There's no question that there's probably a beta-1 receptor mediated reduction in contractile force. It's not just function that has raised the eyebrow, a diminished function of individuals, but there's a number of studies that when they look at troponin levels, and a troponin measure is the same measure that's done to verify whether or not there's been a heart attack. It reflects damage to the myocardium, and sure enough, there's increasing troponin levels that are being reported here showing the histogram, and here showing troponin levels following a long-distance event. The question is this real damage, or is it actual enzyme leakage through what become slightly more permeable membranes? And that's likely the thought, that there's no evidence that there's sustained damage, but the membranes may become leaky and release the substance which mimic cardiac damage. But we don't see any evidence that there's sustained damage to the myocardium. It just reflects a leaky membrane. Now, we've tried to do in an animal model, we take these mice, they're genetically engineered mice called CD1 mice, and this looks like a nice Spirogyra kindergarten homework, but actually to generate these pressure volume loops, it required my grad student Rob Lake, and we had to purchase these high fidelity catheters that cost half as much as my house. And he developed a technique to insert them into the right ventricle, where he was able to monitor the volume of the right ventricle and the pressure. And the blue lines reflect how the right ventricle fills and generates pressure and then relaxes. And this pressure volume loop is probably the gold standard measure of assessing hemodynamic function in a ventricle. And that line here, imagine drawing a line from here up to that corner, and that would reflect the strength of that heart. And of course, the amount that it fills would reflect the size of that heart. Well, what we showed, if we take these mice and exercise the heck out of them, and we use a mouse model in a swimming vat, we found that to be much better than a treadmill. If we expose these mice acutely, in fact, what happens is that their hearts dilate and they generate a little less contractile force. The issue to us wasn't whether or not their heart's fatigued. We know that happens in humans, and it's being demonstrated in mice. What we wanted to see if they were more vulnerable to arrhythmia. And in fact, when we took those mice, and we took sedentary mice, and we tried to stimulate and generate an arrhythmia, we showed some response. In those who swam moderately, they were completely protected from the elicitation of an arrhythmia. But those who swam intensely were much more vulnerable to arrhythmias. So it's the early linkage that we're observing here between a decline in function and propensity for an arrhythmia. Whether or not this is true in humans, we don't know. So to summarize these results, the heart becomes fatigued with exercise, mostly in the ability and how it fills. We don't really think it's all that clinically relevant, but there is animal data that shows that it may be linked to a vulnerability for arrhythmias, but we have to do much more work to have any kind of definitive conclusion. And what about the athlete? And is there a model to explain what may go wrong with long-term training? Well, this is purely hypothetical. So what we know is that with repeated hits of exercise, you can induce some dysfunction. The heart adapts over a period of time to become healthy, robust, but you can acutely undergo some reduction in performance. hypothesis of how exercise may actually induce a remodeled state that's pathological and not physiological is that the repeated hits of exercise are, in this case, much more intense. They tend to have less recovery, and this is in relation to the recommended amount of physical activity, where we, number one, wouldn't even measure if cardiac fatigue occurs, and number two, the chronic exposure to exercise is way less. And the concern is that intensive exercise may lead to a phenotypic, in other words, an expression induced by altered physiology. It may induce an actual pathological state that may be similar to some gene-related disorders like cardiomyopathies. And I'll talk about that in a second. So we began a large study that we're just about finished, where we've recruited almost 200 endurance athletes, and a subset were imaging with cardiac MRI. And these are some preliminary data. One of the questions is, does repeated hits lead to remodeling that may be adverse, such as the development of fibrosis? And what we found is, indeed, in the endurance athletes, there's a small percentage of individuals that develop some evidence of fibrosis, far fewer than that in the recreational cohort. And these are just images that show, and if you don't know how to read these things, you have to have a tremendous imagination. But I'll point out here, that is an abnormal demonstration of scar, as opposed to here, where there's none at all. And of course, the million-dollar question is this clinically relevant? What does it mean? And there's been 3 or 4 studies so far that have shown fibrosis in left and right hearts, but there's no clinical link to adverse outcomes. And in order to do that study, we need to do long-term studies. And this is part of the problem. How do we actually distinguish an abnormal ventricle from what is in fact pathological? And this is the issue that is creating great debate amongst the experts who are examining the validity and the efficacy of cardiovascular screening in athletes. The athlete's heart, we know, gets bigger and it gets healthier. It's very difficult to identify certain inheritable conditions that may look like an athlete's heart, or vice versa. It's very difficult to differentiate an athlete's heart from those that may have disease. In some cases, the electrocardiogram may pick up a specific anomaly, such as an anomaly related to a channelopathy called long QT syndrome. And that's something that can be identified by an electrophysiologist on an ECG. But when we look at structural related disease, such as hypertrophic cardiomyopathy or arrhythmogenic right ventricular dysplasia, ARVC, that's a lot easier to say. It is a condition that has a much higher prevalence in Italy than hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is much more prevalent in North America. So the regional differences become part of the challenge in determining whether or not screening is useful. But even experts of MRI imaging who have special training in athletic remodeling find the identification of ARVC on examination without any genetic indication very difficult to distinguish. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is the same, but it's a little more easy to diagnose through simple measures like ECG. The challenge with these inherited conditions are that in ARVC is an excellent example. It is a progressive disease that relates to the desmosomal connections in the heart. So the heart's muscle cells are connected by these connective tissue cells called desmosomes. They're essentially the mortar in between the brick. They give the heart the structural stability. And if there's a dysfunction in those, we have a problem. Very difficult to identify. In the case of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, it's also progressive, but it may not always be identified. The other concern is whether or not athletes get heart disease. There's evidence now, heart disease meaning blockages of the artery, And there's evidence, in fact, that when we image the hearts using to determine if they've got calcification, which is a relatively recent method to ascertain the burden of coronary disease, athletes actually have more calcium in their arteries than non-athletes. And so it's led some to conclude that they may be more vulnerable to coronary plaque development. Well, the fact of the matter is that they have far less heart disease than the average. And what we actually think is that the calcification leads to a much more stable arterial plaque than an unstable one, so that they may be actually less vulnerable for heart disease. This is an emerging area of research. We don't really know the full answers, but I would conclude by saying that you're probably at less risk of coronary disease-related events if you're an athlete. Pro-arrhythmia, all of these athletes have one thing in common, and that's atrial fibrillation. It ended Mary Lemieux's career. Atrial fibrillation, very quickly, is a disruption in the atrial electrical pattern, and instead of having a nice normal distribution of the electrical activity throughout the atria down to the AV node and then a normal heartbeat, you have these renegade electrical conductions that cause the upper chambers to beat irregularly. And we know in the normal population, people who get atrial fibrillation are older, they have hypertension, they tend to have obesity, there's a number of risk factors, but there's about a 5 times elevation in atrial fibrillation in athletes. And we don't know why. We know that the more individuals race, the more likelihood exists. We know that the more intense that they train, the greater the likelihood they are. So it's become a dominant enough issue that it's now excessive exercise, high volume, high intensity exercise is now considered an actual risk factor as identified by various authorities. This is a complex problem. We don't know why exercise induces a greater risk. We know it's related to atrial enlargement and high vagal tone. We're trying to figure that out, but I think we're a few years away. But certainly, as some of my colleagues say, that you've got about a 5 times greater risk if you own one carbon fiber, but you've got a much higher risk if you own multiple. That's not really true, but there may be some truth to that. Now, this is a huge list of individuals. These are world-class known athletes, and they all have one thing in common as well. They've all died from sudden cardiac death during exercise. It's a large number, but is it? The first reported sudden cardiac death may have come from Philippides himself, who ran to declare victory over the Persians, and in his last breath, he dropped dead. So the question is, how does exercise trigger those events, and do they happen a lot in athletes? They don't. They happen about 1 every 100 to 300,000 cases, and certainly in diagnosed disease, the risks of cardiac sudden death is much greater, much more common in males than females, more often in college athletes and high school athletes, more often in black athletes and Caucasian athletes. Ryan Shea died during the US Olympic Marathon, about 6 kilometers into it, and his autopsy revealed patchy fibrosis, but unclear diagnosis. Brian Maxwell, 3rd-ranked marathon runner in the world in 1977. He's from Toronto. He crashed and burned during a marathon and got interested in nutritional requirements and started to make these concoctions with his girlfriend, soon-to-be wife, nutritionist, and developed a power bar. Sold it for $375 million, retired to California, continued to run. And on the way to the post office, he decided to mail a letter and dropped dead. He was diagnosed with aortic stenosis when he was young, but continued to train, and his autopsy revealed fibrosis. His time was up. So exercise in both cases likely triggered an adverse response, but these conditions were not fully appreciated upon examination. If we look at the athletic population from triathletes, a recent study just published, very low incidence of, and I'm going to fly through some of this quickly because I'm mindful of the time. Most of the deaths are In older triathletes, they occur typically during the swim. They've got a coronary disease that's undetected. Some of them have structural or inheritable conditions. Why the swim? We don't know. One logical explanation is that it's the first thing that they do. The other hypothesis is that in some cases there's very little warm-up prior to the swim. There is sudden exposure to cold water, arm work, greater stress on the heart, but that's a lot of great physiological conjecture. We just don't know. But we know that the rates are a little higher in triathletes compared to marathon running, but I think that's just a function of the numbers. Where do we go with all of this information? And part of the issue is really in trying to convey a sensible message to the public and to athletes as to whether or not exercise is safe. And I think the real confusion is probably best shown in this quick little clip.
Das hier ist mein Tor. Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät des Küstenwächters. Das Gerät und das Gerät. Überlebensradar.
Mayday, mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... Over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
Okay, so I think that's how many of us and many of the public, their understanding of exercise risk and heart is exemplified by that video. I'm going to leave this up, or I can come back to it in questions, but let me just ask these questions of you. If you were told you had an inheritable heart condition and you had a greater risk of sudden cardiac death during exercise, would you stop or would you reduce your exercise? Just take a second to think about that. If you were a podium level athlete and you had the same condition, would you stop exercise? And of course, if you were a parent of that elite athlete, what would your answer be? These are very, very difficult questions to answer. And the challenge with screening, this is one example. These are math done from existing data of Italian data where screening is the law. You'd have to, in order to prevent one death, you'd have to screen 38,000 athletes. And let's say we have the financial resources to do that, and Italy has made that. 800 would be wrongly disqualified. In other words, a false positive would lead to their disqualification from competitive athletics. Even if we enhance our ability to detect by using more refined ECG criteria, 6% of individuals would still be ruled out of performing competitive sport. And this is part of the big issue in athletic screening. The take home, exercise is good for you. The likelihood of lowered chronic diseases are far less. Longevity is enhanced from the normal athlete to the elite athlete. It does increase the risk of certain arrhythmias like AF. Sudden death is extremely rare. It does happen. Most of the causes are inheritable conditions that are very difficult to detect in some cases. Screening protocols exist, but they're not widely adopted in many areas of the world. So that reports on balance of excessive exercise being bad for you are grossly overstated, but monitoring and surveillance is certainly important. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for your talk.
Thank you.
So I do a little bit of family medicine and sports medicine in Vancouver, and I totally agree with a lot of the things. You know, most people I see are kind of age group or masters athletes, and if they ask them with their hearts, I tell them what you said, mostly that they should control their blood pressure, not smoke, take good care of themselves. But I think there are some groups of athletes that kind of give me pause. And I have seen some of the data kind of in that like 1 in 300,000 group be distilled down kind of nicely. When you take these like athletes, okay, now take just the younger ones, just the male ones, just the male Black athletes. And they have these kind of higher prevalences of sudden cardiac death. And so I know that right now a lot of our focus is on not screening athletes as a generalization in Canada. But if you go back to your slide way in the beginning with like the Seattle criteria, how you have triathletes kind of up in that red zone, do you think that there are any groups who would warrant more careful attention?
It's a great question. So the Canadian Cardiovascular Society is in fact, we've established a primary writing group to put out a position statement on screening of athletes. So this is underfoot right now. I can tell you we're already fighting. And I don't think the issue is should there be screening. I think that everyone agrees that some degree of athletic screening should occur. The issue is what does that mean? And as soon as we start to discuss the electrocardiogram as part of that screening process, the pillows start flying and people will have very strong feelings on one side or the other. And the evidence is not clear as to whether or not ECG screening is of value in light of the limitations, so on and so forth. But there's very complex ethical issues that arise from the whole process. Apart from falsely identifying somebody and the follow-up that's required and the stress that's involved that may lead to a resolution of the restriction, the whole issue of whether or not who is making the decision is part of the discussion as well. I personally think it should be the athlete, informed by as much evidence as is realistically possible. But others will argue that it's unethical to focus on screening an athletic population that may be relatively young, where the greatest burden of disease and risk of cardiac sudden death may be in the older recreational athlete who's a weekend warrior or trying to run a marathon once a year. So it's a complex decision, but we're working on it and we hope to have it ready for next fall.
Thanks so much for the talk. Two really quick questions. As coaches get more connected with our athletes via monitoring and whatnot, is there anything that we can be empowered with to try to red flag athletes that might need further follow-up?
Yeah, there's a lot of great sources that are actually part of basic screening protocols from history to symptomatology. The obvious ones are athletes who have dizzy spells, but they may be related to dehydration. Syncope, first-degree relatives who die before the age of 50. There's a set of questions that, I think that a lot of what's being discussed in terms of getting very close in touch with these feelings of athletes and any symptoms that may arise. I think whenever there's a concern of arrhythmia, that may be expressed by syncope, dizziness, unusual shortness of breath that's way beyond what their training regimen would call for. Those are signs that it's worth following up, and it's certainly better safe to be sorry. But it's a very difficult terrain because we're looking for a very, very tiny needle in a very big haystack.
Yeah. And the second one was, you talked a lot about high intensity training and how that can affect the heart negatively. What about lower intensity, more volume cardiac training to help strengthen the cardiac system?
Right, so I had this conversation earlier. I would say that there's evidence that the heart fatigues but fully recovers after prolonged exercise of moderate or light or intensive exercise. I'm not really talking about high intensity interval training. There's no real evidence that one is more effective at altering cardiac size and function. So I think the biggest thing that can be worked into a training program to ensure healthy or physiological cardiac adaptation is rest and adequate recovery between those high intensive bouts. But we have people who are 30 hours a week in our cohort and their hearts really don't look all that big And the key is proper function. And a degrading heart will be reflected in performance by shortness of breath and a unexplainable diminished performance. And I think those are the things, apart from symptoms, that are good to look at. If you've got an athlete whose times are going down and they are training ever as intensely as they should, and there's an incongruous response between their performance, and they also start to show physical signs of fatigue, that's worth a follow-up. It may be absolutely nothing to do with heart function, but it's worth following up.
Thanks for a great talk and a great overview of things. I wanted to emphasize some things and ask you some questions. As when I started doing triathlon, I had AFib and talked to my cardiologist, who was Pam Douglas, about the dangers of it, was reassured, and went on and raced to be involved in the care of athletes. And there's been a lot of stuff in the press, and there's a lot of concern among athletes, especially the athletes approaching middle age, I suppose, about sudden cardiac death. And I thought an interesting paper on that, I believe it was the British Medical Journal, and you'll remember it, but they actually looked at the probability of cardiac death running a marathon versus driving to the marathon, and it was more dangerous to drive to the marathon than it was to run in the race. I've been fortunate to be the director or advisor or participant in healthcare at 50 plus triathlon world championships, and we've had very few very serious problems, but 3 years ago we had someone die here, and then I went back to Hawaii and we had someone die in the Lava Man race, which is another Olympic distance race. It's a shattering thing. It's really a shattering thing. So let me emphasize the things you had said, where if you're a coach and you have athletes who are obviously periodically having problems, or if they talk to you and confide that, gee, I have this funny feeling in my chest after the race, or I was racing and all of a sudden I had to slow down, and you really want to make sure you follow up on that 100% and get them to see someone who knows what they're doing, an experienced sports medicine physician. And if they go see a cardiologist, as you emphasized, you want them to see a cardiologist who has experience in sports medicine, because otherwise you'll have them chasing things down rat holes that are very expensive and non-productive. The real question was, so if you're going to screen people, if you're going to be looking at say, men over 50 or men over 40 or men over 60, what would be a meaningful test? Because this argument about doing EKGs on people, I'm a member of our medical committee, as is Umberto here for ITU, and Sergio is our chairman and is very, very passionate about testing to catch those people who might die otherwise. And you hear people, Ben Levine debating Greg White Sir Greg, about whether or not screening is worthwhile. They're both brilliant and they have very different opinions about it. What test would be meaningful? If costs were no object, what test would you actually perform on people other than a questionnaire and a physical exam, which probably is going to show you nothing for if somebody can go out and even do one of our races? What tests would be meaningful to evaluate the risk for people?
Well, it's a great question. A couple of quick things on that motor vehicle issue. There is a study, a guy out of Toronto actually published it, showing that there were fewer, you would save motor vehicle accident deaths by road closures. You would save more lives than lives would be lost in marathons, simply by road restrictions in the large marathons. So there is a value in having marathons simply to reduce motor vehicle accident deaths. To answer that question, this may be hugely disappointing, but I don't know what that is. We've begun a systematic evidence-based approach in making a position statement on screening in Canada. And if money and time was no impediment, I think you'd start logically with history, a full inventory, trying to extract symptoms and family history, and you do an ECG, and you do an echo, and you do an MRI, and if you forget about the echo, and forget about the MRI. And if you did all of those things and you made it mandatory for all athletes in high schools and colleges, varsity programs throughout North America, the cost would be about $20 billion. And from a public health perspective, how much is a life worth? Some will argue it's worth about $50,000 per person year saved. It's more costly to do athletic screening. So I don't know the answer to that. I think to get meaningful data, and the issue is risk-benefit, and is there risk by over-screening people? And there probably is. Would you want to be the athlete that's told you shouldn't compete? And then 5 years later. And the other thing about the triathlon data is that the 1 in 300,000 that came out of that recent study, we did the math, and assuming the prevalence of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, it means that 109 of that data, 199 athletes probably had hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and raced more than 10 times and had no adverse outcome. So if you do the math that way, even if you have a genetic predisposition for a cardiomyopathic condition, you may never die during exercise. That's the challenge of screening. So I don't know the answer to that. It's a great question. What would you do?